Okay, so we might begin the session if that's okay with everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Please do let me know if you can't in the Q&A feature. And for those of us joining live through Zoom, if you have any questions at any point during this session, please do feel free to put them into the Q&A section and I'll answer them as best I can. So first and foremost, thanks very much everyone for taking the time to join us live here in Zoom or else to watch the recording if that's what you're currently doing. And in this session, I'm hoping to just give a quick refresher of the Turnitin system in MTU and as well, obviously, Gen AI and kind of the impact that's had on assessment. That's a real wicked problem. So it's not something that we're going to be able to adequately cover, I think, in the session today. But it is something that I'll try and address towards the end of the session. But like I said, any questions, or comments, or anything at all, please do let me know in the Q&A section here in Zoom. And I'll talk a bit about the end if you're watching the recording, how you can make your voice heard or let us send us on any questions that you might have. So just very briefly, what we're going to look at in this session today is to identify what Turnitin is, to look at a Turnitin assignment, how to access the plagiarism report that Turnitin produces, how to interpret that plagiarism report, and also just some general comments on, I suppose, in and around Turnitin, using Turnitin effectively, and like I said, to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and assessment also. So Turnitin, as I'm sure we're all pretty aware at this stage, is a web-based plagiarism detection system, or a better description is a potential plagiarism detection system. So the way Turnitin works is very simply, it checks work submitted by students for unoriginal content. So content that might have been copied from publications, articles, book chapters, the World Wide Web, and also potentially submissions from other students in MTU or from other universities across the world. And Turnitin is integrated into the Canvas system here in MTU, and it's available for use by MTU lecturers and students across all modules. So if this is the overall, I suppose, e-learning or technology enhanced learning ecosystem within MTU, Turnitin sits up there in terms of assessment. And as you can see, it's an external tool, but it's plugged in. It's very kind of deeply integrated into the Canvas system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive in straight away to, I suppose, the process of setting up a Turnitin assessment and how to interpret the results that come out of it. But maybe just to take a second, I would just like to maybe talk a bit about kind of the process for submission storage in Turnitin. It's just kind of useful context, I think, before we get into the demonstration. So basically with Turnitin, there are a number of options on what exactly Turnitin will do with any work submitted to it from your students. So I suppose all we really mean by that is that when a student submits a paper to a Turnitin assignment here in MTU, you have the decision on what exactly Turnitin should do with that student submission. So there's three options with that. One is the standard paper repository. So what that basically is it's kind of Turnitin's global database of student work. So if there's a university in Australia and in Austria and in Azerbaijan, and they all have this option for standard paper repository selected in their Turnitin assignment, what that means is that Turnitin will take all of the student work submitted from all those different universities, and it'll put into this kind of global database. And what this global database means is very simply any university that goes to check student work, they'll be able to ask Turnitin to check this global repository. So essentially, student work is kind of all it really means is that it gets added to Turnitin's kind of global database of student work. The institution paper repository option, what that refers to basically is just that that is an MTU specific Turnitin database. So what that means is that if this option is selected, that Turnitin will add submitted student work to kind of a local MTU database of student work, but it won't share it with other universities. All that really means is, I suppose, it's kind of between the first option and the second option. The second option just means that Turnitin and MTU will be able to check um, any submissions against any other MTU submissions, but other universities won't be able to. So essentially, if the second option is selected, it just means that MTU student work will not be shared outside of MTU. And then not storing the submitted papers basically means that students that submit to this particular assignment, their work will be checked against everything, but Turnitin will not retain student works that are submitted in. Hopefully that makes some bit of sense. If it doesn't, please let me know in the Q&A option here in Zoom. Hopefully it'll become a little bit clearer when we get into the actual Turnitin setup and submission process. But yeah, it's maybe just useful context to have. So to get right into it, the way in which we can create a Turnitin assignment is very similar to how we create a regular Canvas assignment. So we go into our Canvas module, we go into the assignments area, and we click on the blue assignment button. We give a title, we'll call this sample Turnitin assignment. We can add a brief, points, assignment group, display grades as. You can modify those however you see fit. An important element then in terms of plagiarism or the ability to add a Turnitin process to a particular assessment. You'll notice here that this option is available, plagiarism review. That will only appear if I click file uploads and or text entry. So if you're creating an assignment and you don't see any option for Turnitin, more than likely it's just because maybe file uploads or text entry haven't been clicked. So to use Turnitin, we need to be able to, the assessment in question needs to be either a text entry or a file upload. And file upload is generally what we'd recommend for most assessments. Once one of those options or both of those options are ticked, this option for plagiarism review will become available. And from there, we simply select the only option available, which is Turnitin. And you see that this will give us some additional options then. So as I mentioned, store submissions in basically determines what Turnitin will do with any submissions to this particular assessment. So all this really means is that if we want to Turnitin to kind of add submissions to this particular assessment to the kind of its global database, we can select standard paper repository. If we want, let's say students next year or the year after, if we want their submissions to be compared against any submissions to this particular assignment, we can select institution paper repository, or else if we don't want Turnitin to store students' submissions to this particular assessment, we can click do not store the submitted papers. Now, essentially, it's up to the individual lecturer which of these they would like to pick. It doesn't really affect kind of submissions to this assessment, but it's very simply a question of whether you want submissions to this particular assessment to be added to the global database, just to the MTU local database, or not to be stored at all. And if you're not sure, maybe it's something to discuss with your students, where to what degree Turnitin will retain their work and what it will be used for. The next option then determines what databases Turnitin will compare submissions to this assessment against. So the student repository is essentially its global database. The institution repository, like we said, is the local MTU kind of database, website content, periodicals, journals, and publications. Generally, what we would very simply recommend is that by default, all of these are selected, and we would recommend leaving all of those selected, because if you're comparing submissions to this particular assessment, you want to compare it, I think, to all those different elements. Similarity report options, then you don't have to worry too much about these, as they're things that you can turn on in the actual analysis report. But essentially, turning these on or off just kind of allows a certain level of granularity in how Turnitin interprets the results. So for example, if I click exclude quoted materials, Turnitin will simply, when it's analyzing the student work, anything that's in quotes, Turnitin will say, okay, well, I'm confident that's not plagiarized material. Similarly with bibliographic materials, and small sources really just means, if you decide, okay, sources that are less than 10 words, don't worry about it. Don't even bother counting those as potentially plagiarized material. Again, you don't have to worry too much about these, as they're elements you can turn on in the actual report itself. Now, another important option is when the report will get shown to students. So by default, the option is immediately. The other options is after the assessment is graded, after the due date, or never. I suppose the critical element here, or the important element here, is kind of it's essentially a binary choice. Either the report gets shown to students immediately, or it gets shown. Any of the other options essentially have the same effect. So what the effect is if I show the report to students immediately, all that means is, let's say, if the due date for this is the end of the month, and I set this to show the report to students immediately. What this means is that today a student might submit to it. They'll get shown the report immediately, as in kind of within a half-hour period. And what that does is essentially allows them, let's say they submit a report and they get a plagiarism score of 80%. What they can do before the end of the month is obviously they can come back and they can resubmit it. They can amend their assessment to bring that plagiarism score down. They can resubmit it. And let's say they submit on the due date, the plagiarism report from me, when I go to grade it, might be down to like 20%. If you select the other options after the assessment is graded or after the due date or never, what that really means is that, again, in the same scenario, the student might submit today, but if they're only going to see the report after it's graded or after the due date or never, that means they have no option to resubmit. So a student will, let's say, submit today. The plagiarism score might be in the 90s, but because they're only going to be shown that report after the due date or never or after it's graded, there is no option for them, or there is no chance for them to resubmit the paper. There's no chance for them to go off to amend it to bring the plagiarism score down and to resubmit. So when you show the report to students is important, because essentially, if it's immediately, what you're doing is you're giving students a chance to submit, to see the plagiarism score that comes up, to change it, and to resubmit it. You're giving them the chance to bring that plagiarism score down. If it's any of the other options, they're not really going to have a chance to submit. They submit once, they don't get any feedback about the potential plagiarism score from the system. And when I go to grade it, then yeah, it might be up in the 90s. So essentially, this option determines whether you want to give students that chance to submit, to check the plagiarism score, to amend it to bring it back down, or whether you don't want to give them that chance. So again, that's very much up to yourself. Broadly, we would generally recommend that if you show the report to students immediately, it does give them that option to amend their content and to resubmit. If you remove that option, then they might end up with quite a high plagiarism score, which is not necessarily always indicative of plagiarism, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, it's kind of any of the other options other than immediately is, I suppose, a bit of a harsher option, in our opinion. But again, that's very much up to your own decision. In general, when setting up a Turnitin assessment, the only things you really need to kind of concern yourself with is where the submissions are stored. As we said, we'd recommend leaving all of these ticks, but you can change that if you want. And when you show the report to students. Those are the main options when it comes to Turnitin, really. But when we're happy with all of that, we can hit save and publish. And when a student goes to submit, then very simply, they'll be able to submit. And the only addition from their perspective at this stage will be that they just have to tick this box to agree to the Turnitin end user license agreement. So jumping into a Turnitin assessment that I set up earlier, what we can see is kind of, again, the way that we can kind of access that is after students have submitted, we go into our assignment, we click on Speed Grader, that will pull up the Speed Grader feature. So this is one that I set up earlier, and as you can see here, it's the standard Speed Grader setup. The only addition is that there is this percentage score next to the original student paper. And for us to be able to access the Turnitin analysis report, so the results of the Turnitin check, we simply click on that percentage, and what it will do is it will pull up that analysis report for us. Now, one of the most important things I think when dealing with Turnitin is that obviously this is a bit of an exception because it's something that I've used before, which is why the score is so high. But one of the main things is that uh, sometimes a plagiarism score Turnitin might show it as quite high, but it is most certainly not always the case that that is an accurate reflection. So the important thing with the plagiarism score is not to take it literally. Obviously, this one is a bit of an exception because it's all the way up to 99%. But let's say if a student's work returned a plagiarism detection score of 42%, it's important not to take that percentage literally. More often than not, Turnitin is, we'll say, overly punitive. So, given its job is to detect potential plagiarism, the system tends to count a great number of elements as potential plagiarism. Um, when you get into the marking, it more often than not becomes very clear kind of whether plagiarism has actually occurred. But more often than not, a lot of the potential plagiarism score very often is down to things like very simply materials not being kind of quoted appropriately by the student. So Turnitin interpreting, you know, citations or quoted material as potential plagiarism, as opposed to something which is the student has actually correctly kind of presented or cited. So, like I said, just in general, an important element is not to take the percentage score literally. It always requires or it always benefits from some form of actual human analysis. Um, so in terms of interpreting the score, then what we can do is there's a number of different ways of being able to identify the score, which is provided here. So one element is that you can simply scroll through the student work, which is presented here on the left-hand side, and you'll see that various sections of it are highlighted with different colors. So one thing which we can do is we can very simply click on the on any of the highlighted areas, and in the right hand column, then what that will do is it will pull up the basically where Turnitin thinks this material came from. So one way of doing it is to very simply work our way through this, to click on the areas or on the highlighted content in the left hand side, and then on the right hand side that will show us where Turnitin thinks this content is coming from. So one of the, if we want to learn a little bit more about where the potential content has come from, over in the right-hand column, what we can do is we can see the original kind of link. And what we can do is, if we want to, we can move through the section by clicking on the arrows that are available here. And if we want to learn a little bit more, we can click full source text. So this will then kind of give us the original kind of source content where Turnitin thinks this has been pulled from. Um, Another way of being able to, I suppose, make sense of the score is over on the left-hand side, or excuse me, over on the right-hand side even. What we can do is we can click on match groups or sources, and that will give us the full breakdown of where Turnitin thinks all this content has potentially been pulled from, and we can very simply make our way through that. So over here, what Turnitin has identified is that large percentages of this very simply haven't been cited or quoted, which is why it's interpreting it as potential plagiarism. And the sources then gives us a better idea of where Turnitin thinks this material has actually come from. Now, what can happen sometimes is that you might be confident, let's say, for example, that I gave a student the assessment is based around students in analyzing a particular paper or analyzing a particular web source or so on and so forth. So what can often happen is if I give students an assessment like that, they reference that particular piece or publication or website or whatever it is very constantly, because that's the point of the assessment, and that can have the effect of driving up a potential score. Or else potentially students submitted something, let's say a draft of this particular assessment, and the system is showing that as a high percentage score. So if we do think that there is, let's say I know for a fact that this particular source is something that I'm confident is not plagiarized material. What I can do is I can click on the option here to exclude a source. And what that will do, as you'll see, is that will, if we're able to keep on doing it, what that will do is it will have the effect of, as we exclude sources, that brings down the overall potential plagiarism score. So all that really means is that kind of what you might find is if you do have a let's say a source and you're confident that students have an action that the Turnitin's references to the source isn't actually plagiarized material, you can include or exclude it, and as you do so you'll see that that has the effect of bringing up or down the potential plagiarism score. So for example, it's at 98. If I'm confident that this particular source is not a problem, I can click on it and that will drop it all the way down then to 33. Um, as mentioned, you do have a filter button here, which is essentially where you're comparing the material against. And again, you have a number of exclusion filters here. So exclude quoted text, exclude cited text. So you can apply those as you see fit. As you see, that can have the effect of dropping it down or bringing it up further. And if you change your mind, so if I decide actually I excluded a particular source, but I would like to include it, you can simply click on the option here under exclusions, and you can basically turn individual sources back on or off, or you can click include all sources. And again, if we do that, we can see it's bringing the similarity score all the way back up. If you want to, you can also download a copy of this plagiarism report using the download option up here. So that's the process of creating and interpreting Turnitin reports. Just a couple of final kind of elements then, just with a view to, I suppose, a broader view to assessment within MTU. So what to do if you think there is an instance of plagiarism. So if you have reviewed a Turnitin student's work and a Turnitin analysis report for a particular piece, and if at the end of that process you are pretty confident that plagiarism has occurred, the recommendation is to contact your head of department or your module coordinator. MTU has a new academic integrity policy also, which is available on the website, and that provides a whole range of guidelines and recommendations in terms of process, and I suppose the overall process of what to do in instance of potential a breach of academic integrity. Let's say you have a situation where, let's say for a final thesis or something similar, you might want a situation where you want students to be able to, let's say in, I don't know, February, you want students to submit a draft of their kind of paper, and then before they submit the final thing in May. What you don't want is a situation where the student submits a draft, and that is stored in Turnitin's kind of database, because that means when they submit the final thing in May, Turnitin is going to show it up as like 90-odd% plagiarized for the final submission, because what it's done is it has basically interpreted the draft, or it's counting the draft as yeah, kind of material that the final paper is cogged off. So essentially, in a situation like that, create two assignments, a draft and a final submission. For the draft submission, the setting that you want to have is that you do not store the submitted paper and you show the report to students immediately. So within the Turnitin options, don't store the paper, show it to the student immediately. What that means is for the draft assignment, they'll submit, Turnitin isn't going to retain, it's not going to add it to that draft submission to its database, and it'll show the report to students immediately. If you want to then, for the final submission, if you want to, you can add it to the institution paper repository, the standard paper repository. It won't really matter too much at that point. So Brita in the chat has the €1 million question at the moment, which is how does Turnitin work with AI generated material? So the answer to that is very simply that certainly at present anyway, there are no clear guarantees that any plagiarism detection tool will definitely capture instances of Gen AI developed content. So the short answer is that basically there's a wide range of research, and it has been over the last kind of 2 to 3 years, which is that tools like Turnitin are simply not effective and not reliable at detecting content developed using a generative AI engine. There's a number of different reasons for this. Essentially, the nature of tools like ChatGPT is that they give different answers every time. The whole area is changing so fast that it's very hard to keep on track of things. There are also additional tools out there which essentially will humanize content developed using ChatGPT. The other aspect as well is from a student perspective. Very simply, it's very easy for a student, for me, for example, to put content into ChatGPT, so to get kind of an assessment, some response out of ChatGPT, and then just to simply rewrite it in my own words, or maybe I move this paragraph over here, I delete this, I rephrase this, and if I submit it to something like Turnitin, then Turnitin is simply not going to catch that kind of content. So the short and unfortunate answer is that there is no tool out there at the moment which will catch content developed using tools like ChatGPT. And I would say, whatever vendors in this space may claim, it's extremely unlikely, barring some kind of major breakthrough, or unless, systems like Turnitin are given full access to some kind of database of, for example, content which ChatGPT has developed, which is an extremely difficult kind of prospect in itself. It's very unlikely that any tool is going to be able to provide that functionality. There is also the danger, and there are many, many, many such cases of this, of false positives, where tools like Turnitin will take content which has been genuinely developed by students, original material developed by students, honest submissions, and marked them up as content developed using ChatGPT, which is a whole other problem in and of itself. So instead of relying on a tool like Turnitin, I think definitely does still have its place. It is still important to be able to, particularly maybe for more advanced student work, to be able to try and catch material which has been taken from book chapters, publications, journals, web content, so on and so forth. It is still important to be able to try and analyze that. But rather than relying on tools like Turnitin to catch Gen AI developed content, our recommendation is focusing efforts on setting clear AI assessment parameters, highlighting the presence of YouTube as opposed to relying on it, and in focusing assessment on things that Gen AI tools don't do well, like reflection, like critical analysis, like working with real world data. So the kind of process of assessment, and also talking to students, something which is available as well. I've been working with the TLU on a kind of basically an online course and a series of AI assessment briefs. So essentially those, again, rather than relying on a tool like Turnitin, what we would recommend is potentially looking at those kind of assessment briefs and just maybe seeing if it's possible to restructure or to amend current assessment briefs to not to facilitate AI assessment, AI in students' assessments, but to be able to, I suppose, communicate clearly to students. And I think a lot of it really does come down to trying to communicate clearly to students whether you are happy for them to use AI or not happy for them to use AI. And if it's the former, what for a particular assessment they are allowed to use AI for and what they're not allowed to use AI for. And that is kind of an attempt to find some kind of middle ground in terms of academic integrity, and also as well potentially trying to prepare students for work, for industries, for tasks where employers might want them to use AI tools for efficiency purposes, or from a student perspective, and a particularly important element for students to have a good idea within their particular industry, within the particular subject area that you're teaching them. Okay, I've tried AI for this particular task, and these are elements of the task that AI does well. And these are elements of the task that AI does not do well, which is where my expertise, my training, the instruction that I've gotten as a student from lecturers such as yourselves will kind of make a difference. Um, so just before I get onto supports, there are one or two questions in the Q&A, so thanks for those. I'll answer those now. So Erica asks, if you don't store the paper, can it still be compared to other submissions for the same assignment from other students? So yeah, absolutely, Erica. So if I think I've understood the question correctly, you can select the option to not store the submitted paper. So anything a student submits to this particular assignment, it won't get stored in the Turnitin database. But you can still compare any student submissions to, yeah, anything else which is added, if that makes sense. So maybe in terms of, like you said, for the same assignment, yeah, for the same assignment, you probably would need to maybe add submissions. So for example, other student submissions to this particular assignment, you would select the institution paper repository, let's say, and you would compare student submissions against student repository, the institutional repository. Uh, yeah. Does that make some kind of sense, Erica? And Erica also asks for which percentage of Turnitin should we be concerned. It's a good question, and unfortunately, there's no real clear answer around that, Erica, because it is quite open to interpretation. I would say, anything under kind of 20% is usually pretty safe. Um, so more often than not, that would really usually just indicate, um, uh, maybe a student has quoted material but didn't put the kind of quotation marks around it, so on and so forth. Um, Anything kind of 20 and above, I think warrants some investigation, as in some kind of serious investigation. But like I said, it really does vary, and I've seen student work which is entirely kind of original appear like with a potential plagiarism score like up in the 40s. And again, that's not the case that the student has, breached academic integrity. As I mentioned, Turnitin, it might be the case that they have, might be the case that the student has kind of cited extensively or quoted material extensively, and Turnitin, like I said, being a bit punitive, is just interpreting that as kind of potential plagiarism. So one or two questions about where to find the AI assessment brief examples. So yeah, sorry, I kind of skipped over that. But essentially, there is you can enroll. We've set up a module which has these. So the MTU AI assessment scale briefs that is available. You can enroll on that through Catalog, which is kind of the kind of sign up system for additional module or Canvas courses for staff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out an email after the session with the recording, and I'll also include a link to that particular catalog link within that email. So essentially after the session, I'll send out an email, and that email will have a link to that catalog module within it. And yeah, that is very simply a module which has a number of different assessment types. So essay briefs, lit review briefs, presentation briefs, so on and so forth. And within each of those is aligned to that framework, the AI assessment scale. And again, these are very much just they're not meant to be taken literally. So please don't feel like you have to take this and put it in front of students exactly as is. It's really more just kind of, I suppose, a bit of an example of what could be done. So for example, within this particular assessment brief, because it's at level 3 of the assessment scale, the major difference really is just you're identifying to students, okay, you can use AI for research assistant, for generating initial drafts. You're not allowed to use AI to write any of the content for you, to replace your own critical analysis, so on and so forth. But yeah, to answer the questions, when I send out the email after this session, I'll include a link to that catalog inside there. That's it really. There's a number of supports. If you do need help with Turnitin have a help center. We also have a number of help articles on the TEL website, or sorry, you can access the help articles from the TEL website. But yeah, just before I finish up, can I ask if there's any other questions? I'm aware that was a real whistle stop tour, but yeah, I suppose it's just a lot to cover. I don't want to try and keep people any longer than I have to. But if there's any final questions, I'm happy to take those now. Okay, well, nothing else seems to be upcoming. So all that is left is simply to say thanks very much, everyone, for coming along to the session. Thanks for anyone watching the recording. We will be doing more training over the coming few weeks. But otherwise, wishing you the very best with the start of the semester, and hopefully see you all again soon. So thanks very much, everyone.